And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. This is a conversation we almost didn't have, not because the topic was overlooked, but because the shape of its absence was hard to name. What follows is not a correction, but a deepening. Not an answer, but a response, rooted in quiet noticing and carried forward by care. Some episodes begin with questions we plan. Others arrive by invitation. This one was offered not with urgency, but with accuracy. It asked us to consider the space between attention and presence, between thought and reception. It asked what is lost when connection becomes conditional on clarity or on speed. You won't find a list of symptoms here or solutions. What you'll find is attention paid to attention itself, to the way it moves, hides, stretches, curls inward and waits, especially in minds that move differently, especially when those minds are not met. This is an essay that listens forward. It carries with it a voice we took seriously, a voice that asked us not to revisit the topic, but to re-enter the room where it was first named and stay a little longer. What you're about to hear is what became possible when we did. It was said quietly, almost in passing, though the shape of it lingered, a sense that something vital had been left unspoken, not an oversight, but a silence with weight. The episode moved through ADHD with care, touched on its patterns and pulses, its gifts and challenges, but one thread remained loose. What happens when attention, especially the kind shaped by divergence, is pulled away from the human moment and into the ambient churn of modern life? Not just distracted, but diverted, bent toward the transactional, the screen-lit, the distant. And in that bending, something is lost. The language used stayed with us, not just about disconnection, but something deeper. A stifling, a hijacking, the slow, almost invisible erosion of the capacity to create, to relate, to contribute. Not because the mind is broken, but because the conditions are. It was a kind of theft, not theoretical, intimate. The theft of presence, of relational voltage, of the quiet clarity that ADHD-gifted attention can bring when allowed to land. Studies speak into this space. Patterns show that frequent digital media use correlates with heightened ADHD symptoms over time. But beneath those lines on a graph is something harder to capture. The moment a conversation splinters because the room no longer knows how to stay. The way a child full of unsaid brilliance watches a parent's gaze flicker to a phone. The sentence never finished, the insight never spoken aloud. There is something uniquely relational about the ADHD rhythm. It is not simply internal. It sinks, stretches, reflects. Divergent thinking, too, is deeply social, born not in solitude, but in the electric field between people. When that field is thinned by distraction, the gift doesn't vanish, but it withholds. Not by choice, by atmosphere. Perhaps what was offered wasn't correction, but an invitation to look again. To notice the slow drift from human to elsewhere and to name what is being given up in the process. Not to blame, but to ask, what would it take to hold attention differently? What if presence was not a luxury, but a design principle? And underneath all that, quietly, steadily, the hope that someone might say yes, that this time the room might stay. Sometimes the shift is internal. The ADHD mind, having adapted to too many interruptions, begins to interrupt itself. A kind of preemptive fragmentation. Thoughts arrive, vivid and complex, but are second-guessed before they're spoken, not because they lack value, but because they no longer feel receivable. The attention needed to hear them, to hold their shape, has been siphoned elsewhere, and so they are left to drift, unvoiced. What begins as a defensive rhythm can become a default. Divergence masked as detachment, insight held in reserve. The person remains warm, animated, perceptive, but something has curled inward, not broken, just waiting for a space that can meet it. There's something structurally unfair about this. The very environments that trigger attentional scatter are the ones that also fail to value the kind of thinking most affected by it. In classrooms, in offices, in families, the fast and focused are rewarded, but the slow blooming thought, the relational leap, the pattern sensed rather than planned, these often go unseen. And when digital attention economies flood the margins, that invisibility deepens. Not only is the ADHD thinker pulled from presence, they are also quietly edited out of it. The language of giftedness here is not decorative. It names a way of processing that is often non-linear, associative, porous. These are not deficits. They are different timelines of cognition, but they require support. Not praise, structure, not discipline as containment, but as coherence. Something that steadies attention without shrinking it, that allows the divergent to remain divergent, but tethered gently to something human. Design plays a role. The choice to silence notifications, the layout of a shared space, the willingness to value depth over performance. But more than design, it's about recognition. Seeing that the loss named earlier, the theft of divergent connection, is not inevitable. It is preventable and recoverable if the conditions change. This might sound abstract, but it isn't. It could look like a teacher allowing the ADHD student to explain their answer sideways. A partner who doesn't mistake silence for absence. A workplace that makes room for spirals as well as steps. A culture that understands presence not as constant eye contact, but as a form of listening that adapts to the shape of the speaker. Not all attention needs to be fixed. Some needs to be followed. And in that following, something returns. Not just focus, but trust. The sense that the room is still capable of holding what matters before it slips away again. There's a truth that lives in the pauses between interactions, in the gap between what's noticed and what's absorbed. Attention, when it lands well, creates a kind of shared architecture, room for presence to stretch out, for ideas to meander, for unexpected connections to appear. But when that architecture is undermined by constant pull toward the transactional, toward the elsewhere, a slow disorientation sets in. The space becomes more brittle, the offer to connect more cautious. The creative impulse, once abundant, starts to ration itself, not because the impulse has gone, but because it no longer knows where to land. What's being named here isn't simply a struggle with distraction, it's the quiet heartbreak of not being met. The kind of exhaustion that comes from having to compress one's way of thinking into something legible to systems that prefer speed over depth, clarity over nuance, volume over vibration. For those whose attention is already non-linear, whose thoughts arrive through image, rhythm, effect, the demand to conform becomes not just tiring, but alienating. And yet there's resilience in that divergence. ADHD attention, especially when paired with creativity, often reveals what others miss. It holds pattern in the corner of the frame. It hears the unfinished sentence and imagines 5 endings. But without presence, true sustained presence, those gifts can't translate. They remain internal artifacts, alive but unreleased. This isn't a call to shut down technology. It's a call to reconsider what kind of attention we design for and who we exclude when we equate attention with efficiency. When we build systems that reward frictionless focus but penalize digression, we don't just lose productivity, we lose texture. Immediacy becomes the enemy of intimacy. That's why the question remains, what does it mean to protect divergent attention, not by narrowing it, but by housing it? Not by disciplining it into silence, but by allowing it to move in the directions it needs to move. And how might our homes, our schools, our devices begin to reflect that permission? Sometimes the solution is infrastructural. Sometimes it's as simple as asking gently, is this the right pace for you? Or setting a table where conversation unfolds slowly enough for detours to feel like destinations. Or just noticing without interruption when someone's thoughts take the long way around. Not everything needs to be shortened. Some things ask to be followed to their natural wandering end. And maybe that's the real question. Do we still know how to follow? There's a difference between attention and surveillance. One offers presence, the other demands performance. For someone whose mind moves in diagonals, the difference is everything. Attention, when it's given freely, allows for detour. It softens time. It says, take the long way, I'll come with you. But surveillance, even well-meaning, compresses. It makes every moment a checkpoint, every pause a problem. And under that gaze, the divergent mind begins to translate itself into what seems more acceptable, which often means less alive. This translation is costly, not in volume. Many still speak, still contribute, but in resonance. The ideas that once curved outward begin to straighten. The rhythm becomes more cautious. Creative leaps shrink into outlines. And eventually the act of offering becomes effortful. Not because there's nothing to say, but because the risk of not being understood has grown too familiar. What's being named gently is a kind of misrecognition, not of pathology, but of possibility. When ADHD is seen only as something to manage, the conversation stops before it begins. But when the question shifts, when we ask what this form of attention reveals, what it makes possible that other minds cannot, we move from accommodation to revaluation. We stop asking how to fix and start asking how to receive. There's data to support this shift. Divergent thinkers, especially those with ADHD, consistently generate higher levels of ideational fluency in open-ended tasks. They are not distracted by nature. They are alert to more stimuli. And when given environments that value exploration over completion, their strengths become visible. They don't need silence. They need signal. Not less stimulation, but the right kind. That recalibration doesn't have to be grand. It can be a change in how meetings are run, in how questions are asked, in how long someone is allowed to pause before a reply is expected. It can be as simple as naming that the room is safe for unfinished thought. Because in the end, what's often withheld isn't brilliance, but risk. The risk of saying something sideways, of answering in image instead of argument, of tracing connection before conclusion. But when someone knows the space will hold that, something shifts. Attention returns, not tamed but welcomed. The mind uncoils, and in that return the room itself changes, becomes more interesting, less efficient, more alive. A voice asked us to look again, not loudly, not in protest, just with the quiet insistence that something had been missed. That while the conversation moved forward, with insight, with care, something essential had been left at the edge of the frame. Not information, not theory, but presence. The kind of presence that attends rather than observes, that receives rather than organizes. It named a pattern felt, but rarely spoken. That when attention is redirected toward the transactional, especially in those whose attention moves relationally, associatively, soul first, something begins to slip. Not all at once, not with drama, but with a thinning of texture, a fade. What was once a capacity for creative contribution to relationships, to society, to shared understanding, becomes harder to access. Not because it's lost, but because the room no longer knows how to hold it. That voice did not ask for correction. It asked for witness. And more than that, it asked whether we could feel the cost. Not just to those with ADHD, but to all of us when divergence is displaced by design, when the ambient pressure to respond, to click, to scroll, to perform overrides the slower rhythm of recognition, when the gaze shifts from the human to the metric and no one names what went missing. It's a point of view that understands not just the psychology of attention, but the ethics of it, that how and where we look determines who gets seen, and how long we stay determines what can be shared. That creativity is not a private resource, but a relational offering. And when we mistake transaction for connection, we risk interrupting the very contributions we most need. So we return, not with solution, but with reorientation. We ask slower questions. We make room for delay. We start to notice when presence is performative and when it is real. We remember that not every divergence is a deviation. Some are maps, some are forms of care, and maybe that's all it takes. Not a rewrite, just a pause, a moment where the attention that had been pulled outward is invited back. Not forcibly, just enough, just gently, so that what was always there watching, listening and waiting might feel the atmosphere shift and begin once again to speak. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.